Tuesday marks 6 months since the deadly assault on the U.S. Capitol. Supporters of former President Donald Trump stormed the building as members of both the House and Senate met to count electoral ballots from the 2020 presidential election. Videos and photos from that day show rioters fighting with and assaulting police officers. 5 people died, including a U.S. Capitol police officer who suffered 2 strokes. In the months since the attack, some Republicans have sought to downplay the severity of what happened that day. That includes Georgia Congressman Andrew Clyde, who compared the attack to a normal tourist visit. CBS News congressional correspondent Nikole Killion joins me now from Capitol Hill for more. Hi there, Nikole. Thank you for being here. So more than 500 people have been arrested in connection with that riot. What more can you tell us about these charges that some of them face?
Well, they really run the gamut, Caitlin. You know, at this point, federal investigators have arrested more than 500 people 6 months since the attack. And so those charges range from assault to, in some cases, obstructing a congressional proceeding or an official proceeding. You know, you also have charges of entering restricted space, you know, for those who breach the grounds of the Capitol. So they really do run the gamut, but you know, beyond these charges and arrests that have already been made, still you have investigators and prosecutors looking for even more suspects out there, hundreds of suspects, in fact, all stemming from January 6th.
And Nikole, what kind of changes are the U.S. Capitol Police looking to implement just to ensure that this doesn't happen again?
Well, the acting chief of Capitol Police, Yogananda Pittman, issued a letter in which she outlined some of the changes that U.S. Capitol Police have made over this past 6 months and also kind of the future of the agency and what they hope to achieve going forward. So a couple of the things that she outlined included increased training, specifically for their civil disturbance unit, which typically handles large crowds and large protests. She also talked about increased mental wellness services for officers. Of course, there's been a lot of questions about the toll that this attack has taken on many of these officers, including, as you mentioned, some who have taken their life since the riot. So that includes, for instance, new therapy dogs that will be serving the force. And then you also have more equipment that the Capitol Police has now procured, and also increased planning, response planning. These were all things that were lacking during the 6th that have been pointed out in subsequent congressional hearings in terms of some of the security and intelligence failures that occurred that day.
Still lasting consequences, even though we're 6 months removed from that attack. I want to ask you about this newly created commission, or newly created committee, I should say, that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced recently. She named 8 members to that committee, that special select committee, to investigate this assault. So the remaining 5 members would be chosen then by House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. Do you know if he's likely to actually appoint any Republicans to this panel?
You know, that's a big question here on Capitol Hill right now. Both chambers are out of session, but before they left last week, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy was asked when he intends to name or recommend some members. At the end of the day, he has to consult with the Speaker about this, so he doesn't necessarily get the final say, and the Speaker can still veto some of his choices. But he did tell me in response to one of my questions that he is taking this committee seriously, but he would not tip his hand as to when he might name anyone, recommend anyone, or who he might name. But obviously, he is in kind of a precarious position because, of course, you have some House Republicans who have, you know, called what happened here on January 6th and called some of these rioters tourists, and some who, in the view of some lawmakers on Capitol Hill, have tried to whitewash the events. So that is a concern in terms of whether or not he he would name somebody like that, or whether or not he would name somebody who did object to the Electoral College results back in January. So those seem to be non-starters in the view of Speaker Pelosi. Of course, we know that she has already selected at least one Republican, that being Congresswoman Liz Cheney. But again, given that a lot of House Republicans did not support this select committee, they did not vote for it, it really is hard to see who the minority leader might pick. But again, we'll just have to wait and see.
Something to watch for when they return from recess, for sure. And finally, Nikole, while I have you, I want to ask you about a bipartisan group of lawmakers that have thrown their support behind the infrastructure deal reached by Democrats and Republican senators and the president. What more can you tell us about this?
So this is the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a bipartisan group of House lawmakers, and they endorsed the Senate bipartisan deal that is still being crafted as we speak right now. There is only a framework agreement, but over this recess, we know that lawmakers continue to try to work out legislative language to match this framework proposal. And so basically this House bipartisan group came out in support of that. But what is interesting is that in their statement, they made clear that they believe this bipartisan bill deserves an up or down standalone vote in the House. And we know that House Democrats and Senate Democrats, for that matter, have suggested that they may potentially link this infrastructure bill with a larger infrastructure bill, a reconciliation bill that kind of deals more with the care infrastructure and the care economy, things like child care, climate, and other issues that are important to Democrats. But what this caucus said is that they really want to deal with this issue and this targeted infrastructure package by itself. So again, will be interesting to see when lawmakers come back, how leadership kind of resolves that, how they deal with that moving forward. But they have made clear they intend to put both of these bills on a dual track.
A lot on the to-do list for Congress when they return to Washington. Nikole Killion, thank you for covering it for us. We appreciate your time.
Absolutely.